Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for Still Doing Life panel that is being sponsored by Straight Ahead, Healing Communities, Pennsylvania, Abolitionist Law Center. And we are definitely glad that you're here tonight. And so today is April 27th. April is Second Chance Month. And so we wanted to have this conversation tonight about second chances. And Howard Zehr and Barb Toews wrote this incredible book called Still Doing Life. And it's actually a second edition of a book that was done about 25 years ago. And we're going to have them with two other amazing panelists tonight. And so my name is David Garlock. I am the faith, community, and legislative advocate for Straight Ahead. And we're glad that each one of you is here tonight. We're hoping to just have this conversation about second chances, have a conversation about life without parole, and why we believe everybody is deserving of a second chance. So let me go ahead and tell you a little bit about our panelists tonight. So Howard Zehr is a distinguished professor of restorative justice at the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisburg, Virginia. He is the author of many books, including the best-selling The Little Book of Restorative Justice. Our next panelist is Barb Toews. She's an associate professor of criminal justice at the University of Washington, Tacoma. Prior to moving to Tacoma, she was a longtime restorative justice practitioner in PA and served as restorative justice program manager at the Pennsylvania Prison Society. Irvin Moore is the Educational Support and Community Liaison for the Restorative Justice Initiative at Penn State. He served 52 years in prison, and he received a commutation last year, and he just celebrated his first freedomversary, and so that's definitely something we want to congratulate him on as he comes on. And our last panelist is Robert Saleem Holbrook. He is the executive director of Abolitionist Law Center and Straight Ahead. He went to prison when he was 16 years old and was sentenced to life without parole. He was released over 4 years ago after serving 26 years. And he has just been a fighter while he was in prison and since he's been out. And we're definitely glad that he's here on this panel too. So thank you all for joining us and being on this panel tonight, y'all. So the first question, and so the people that are watching this panel, so if you guys have any questions, go ahead, put your questions in the chat, and throughout this conversation that we're having, we'll go ahead and answer those. And if we don't get them throughout the conversation there, we're going to have a time for Q&A afterwards. So my first question is actually going to be for you, Howard. Where did the idea for doing life come from, and when did you decide to do Still Doing Life?
Thanks, David. I'm glad to be here and glad to see the rest of you here. I living in Pennsylvania. I moved there in 1990. I was doing some work in particularly in Graterford Prison. So I was running into some lifers, but also I had a friend in Alabama who was serving a life sentence. And he was writing, one time he wrote to me, he said, it's like trying to keep a candle lit in a dark tunnel. And I started wondering, how do they look at people who are serving a life sentence? How do they see a life sentence? What have they learned about life? And so I got permission. I was originally going to do an exhibit. I got permission and interviewed something like 70 men and women. In Pennsylvania, you should understand it's an actual life sentence. Only if you are commuted or some kind of court action do you get out. So it's very rare. And I got permission, and so I did this exhibit. And then some of the guys at Huntsville, not at Huntsville, somewhere, I can't remember where. So there was an article in a national magazine, had some of my photographs and interviews, and they wrote to me a very thoughtful letter and said, we like what you've done, but you didn't go deep enough. And so I went to see them, and that ended up in some more in-depth interviews, and that resulted in the book Doing Life. It came out in 1996. I had always wanted to go back and see how people were doing, how they were coping, what they had learned. What they had to say, but I couldn't get permission. And then Lance Couturier who had retired as head of psychological services for the Department of Corrections, loved this book, and he just said, "You got to do it." And he was instrumental in getting permission for me to get back in 2017. So I interviewed 22 of the same people, asked them to kind of pose the way they had been in the previous book, and it ended up in this book. Barb came on, and I had told Barb at my age and stage of life, nothing's going to happen if you don't take the lead on this, and Barb agreed to do it. So here we are.
Yeah, well, we're definitely glad that you did the first book to bring a lot of awareness to life without parole in Pennsylvania, and also definitely glad that you did the second one. And it came out last month, March 15th. And so, those who are watching this, definitely when you finish watching this, look up the book, reach out to Making Worlds, purchase this book. It's very powerful. That the stories are gonna rock you, and they're gonna give you a different look as far as people serving life without parole. And what's amazing about it is Irvin Moore was in the first book doing life. So Irvin, what was it like to be in that first book?
It was an experience. Prisons were drastically different in those days. This was around, I would say, 93, 94, 95, somewhere around there. And I had already been incarcerated since 1969 and had seen prisons change from, I guess the closest I can get to an example was Shawshank Redemption, where in the old days, in the 60s, we had no radio, no TV. There was no school, no library, no books, no magazines. We walked in lockstep. We didn't speak in the child hall. Prisons were dark, dangerous, and violent places. And the 60s was a period of tumultuous change everywhere across the spectrum. It even impacted us in prison. So change that was occurring out in the community began to occur also inside the walls, behind the walls, and we fought to make change happen. So by the time Howard came in, we were ready for Howard. We were ready for people to hear our stories. Because as Howard said, and as David said, life in Pennsylvania is virtually unlike a life sentence in the majority of the states in this country. Life in Pennsylvania is life until you die. That's what you're sentenced to, life until you die. You're not sentenced to life without parole because in Pennsylvania there has never been parole for lifers. And lifers in Pennsylvania, you talk about a candle in a windstorm. You talk about an experience, an existence bereft of hope, which is the one thing, hope, one thing that could get man virtually through anything. And you have lifers in Pennsylvania who have no hope of going home ever. And how do they deal with that kind of situation? And that's what Howard came in to ask us about. And it was an opportunity for us to answer some of those questions. And I was ready. I was ready. And I appreciated that at the time.
Thank you so much. Barb, coming into the second book, what struck you about those individuals serving life without parole sentences?
I think listening to Irvin talk, the thing that really is coming to mind now is just the amazing human spirit to transcend and cope with just this really horrific kind of experience and surpass and rise above a lack of hope and actually being able to find ways to grow and heal and live a meaningful life. It's that human spirit that I think really struck me.
Okay. Irvin,
Yes, sir.
Going back to what you talked about, that hope, what else got you through those 52 years, because when we think about it, I mean, I'm 42. So you went to prison 10 years before I was born, so just thinking about like my whole life you spent in prison plus 10 years. I mean, what was it that got you through?
Well, actually, it was 11 years before you were born. I've been home for 1 year. So that was 53 years ago when I went to prison. But what got me through? What is the alternative? You either go insane or you commit suicide. And I was not ready to do either of those things. So even serving a life sentence, seemingly without any hope of ever coming home, I still clung to life. I still clung to life. And life in that community at that particular point was my community, and I wanted to make it better. I was only 22 years old at the time. I was virtually a baby. I was so ignorant of life. I put in the book, and one of the statements I made in there in the book was that when I came in, I thought I knew everything and came to realize I knew nothing. But one of the good things that happened is that when rehabilitation, even the word sent chills through our bodies because we didn't know what it was, but it was something that was happening. It was on the wind. The word rehabilitation is happening, it's coming. 1969, 1970, 1971, and things started to change. And one of the things that changed in my life was that I was able to start reading books. I was able to talk with my quote unquote old heads who knew so much. And they helped guide me to the point where I'm sitting here today, a free man, 75 years old, and so in love with life and experiencing it. So what got me through was a host of things, but mainly it was clinging to life.
And that's so powerful, so thank you for sharing that with us,
Indeed.
and as I get ready to ask Saleem this question, just thinking about like you, Irvin, you went to prison at 22, got a life without parole sentence here in Pennsylvania. Saleem went to prison at 16 and got a life without parole sentence for a murder. I went to prison in Alabama at 20 years old for a murder charge and just received 25 years. Where if my offense happened up in Pennsylvania, it could have easily been a life without parole sentence. And so it's definitely something to put into perspective, So Saleem, as a 16-year-old kid, what was it like to be arrested and charged with first-degree murder and given a life without parole sentence?
I mean, it was almost like an out-of-body experience. I think if you talk to most children who were incarcerated and charged and housed with adult offenders, I think most of us would say that it was like an out-of-body experience, and you kind of felt like you were on a conveyor belt that you had no control of, and also you had little consciousness of the events that were transpiring and happening and around you. So, when I remember when I was sentenced, to spend the rest of my life in prison, I'll be honest with you, I really couldn't comprehend the totality of the sentence. I was arrested at the age of 16, and a couple months later at the age of 17, sentenced to spend the rest of my life in prison. So when the judge said, I sentence you to life in prison, it just landed like a dull thud. Had he sentenced me maybe to a term of years that I could have calculated in my head and looked ahead, because one of the things I remember in the county prison was I knew that I was going to do some time. I knew that I was going to go to prison. for years. Right? I had accepted that. So I was like trying to figure out in my head, okay, my sister's husband is 31, 32. No, he wasn't even, I think he was 28 or something. So I'm like, okay, I'm 16. If I get 10 years, well, I'll be 2 years younger than Israel. So, okay. So I could calculate that and I wasn't thinking like 20 years or 30 years. That was beyond the pale, right? So I was like, maybe 10 years. Okay. So I'll be the age of my sister's husband. Oh, okay. Okay, damn. Well, I'll be in here for a while, but when I get out, I'll still be relatively young. When I was sentenced to life in prison, and my lawyer said life is life in Pennsylvania, I just couldn't comprehend it. I couldn't calculate it. And I remember years later when I ran into JoJo Bowens in the hole at SCI Huntington, and he had been in the hole longer than I had been alive at the time. But I remember talking to him about it. And I remember JoJo, I told JoJo something, and JoJo said in his typical way, listen, you ain't even lived yet, so you don't even know what a life sentence is. And I remember like, damn, that's why I couldn't comprehend it, because I hadn't lived. I was 17 years old, so I didn't even know what life was. So it was only until years later in my late 20s and 30s that it dawned on me that this is forever. When I started looking around at people who have been in 40 years, 50 years, that it dawned on me that they are trying to keep me here until I am dead. Life means life. So when you're 16, 17, a child, even in the adolescent years, you haven't lived long enough to comprehend what life is, to know what being sentenced to spend the rest of your life in prison. And even, I was in grade for prison in 1992, 93, 94, when the book Doing Life was being made. I know many of those people in that book. Howard referenced SCI Huntington. I landed in Huntington in the mid 90s and met some of the folks that were in that book too. So I can recall when David told me about this book, I could just recall saying to myself, damn, like they had 25, close to 30 years in 1993, 94 when this book was published. I had only 3 or 4 years in at the time, and they're still in prison. And that is insanity. Like there's no other word to describe it, why they should still be in prison. If you look at those pictures, many of those folks have gray hairs in the pictures from the 90s. They shouldn't have been in prison then. Mm-hmm.
So you guys can know this is the book that we're talking about. Still Doing Life. Definitely get it. So powerful, and as you said, I mean, a lot of these individuals had already done 15 to 25 years before they were interviewed, and it's another 25 years, and it's powerful. I just want to segue on something before we get into the other round of questions. It's something that you said, Irvin, that I want both you and Saleem to talk about, and it's about these old heads, and these are the individuals that were serving life without parole sentences before when you guys got in prison, and the impact of that. Because I know in my own time in prison, I was at a maximum security prison, and the individuals serving life without parole, they were running the behavior modification programs. They were running the prison in essence, So that's something that a lot of people don't understand, that these individuals who have life without parole sentences are in essence running the prisons. Can both of you talk about that briefly?
Well, talking from my experience, it was the old heads who saved my life. Innumerable times when I was a young, wild firebrand, ignorant, not knowing what I was doing, running around. As Saleem said, when you're young, you don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're in store for. You don't even understand the environment you're in. And it was some of these old heads that saved my life, that grabbed me, that did what old heads through time out of mind have always done, provided us through their experience the wisdom and direction that young folk need. I mean, before the warriors of the tribe decided to do anything, they would sit at the feet of the elders and ask their permission, ask them through their experience, what do you think we should do? Now, society seems to have shamefully lost that, and we no longer venerate our elders. And we need to. We need to. So much. We treat our elders the way they treated us in prison by shutting us away, ostracizing us, as if the elders are lepers or dunces, fools, and they're fonts of wisdom and knowledge and information and experience. So the elders in the prison, my old heads, helped me survive and help me become who I am. And now I find myself today, I'm 75 years old today. I mean, it's not my birthday, but I am 75 years old. I appreciate that. I appreciate being this age and in the kind of shape that I'm in. But I speak to a lot of people in this small town that I'm in, State College, Pennsylvania. I was lucky enough to have my home plan here because two of the people that have supported me for the last 15 to 20 years are professors at Penn State University. And they made arrangements for me to come here instead of going where I'm from in Philadelphia. And I think it was the best decision I've made in quite a while. But what I do here is I talk to people. I don't care who you are. I talk to people. Fred and I walk around when he was able to walk, and we talk to people. Fred is a calling card to get people to even notice me and call me, say, hey, pardon me, can you come over here a minute and bring that dog with you? Fred is 170 pounds. He's a St. Bernard. He's a rescue dog in the canine handlers program that I was in Rockview. And Fred is my carte blanche to get into any place, any facility, any room, any venue. And I talk to people about a host of things. When I talk to the young folk, and this is a young folk town because it's a college town, and they're everywhere around us, everywhere. But when I talk to them, one of the things I talk to them is about the elders, how they impacted my life and how they should be impacting their lives if they allow them, if they let them. So I told them to go see your elders, go see your grandparents, go see the old people that live down the street or around the corner, or stop the old lady or the old man that you see struggling with their bags and ask to help them. Then, if you're lucky, ask them to tell you some of their stories. So the impact of the old heads in my life was a blessing. I think it was a godsend. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and I just second all that. I wouldn't be where I am today had it not been for the older prisoners that gave me that guidance, and gave me guidance throughout the years because, it took years for it to get through this thick head of mine.
Oh, yeah.
So there were different old heads along the way that encouraged me to go to a law library, that encouraged me to look inward at my actions and behavior. And then there were old heads to make me look outward at the conditions that influenced that behavior. And then, life does not move linear. It moves circular. And so I found myself extending that same advice to younger prisoners coming up because I had the benefit of being mentored and groomed by older prisoners that, were there to and listen, they were doing this not because they had anything coming from the system. They were doing this because this is who they are. They weren't getting brownie points. They weren't getting good behavior points. They were doing this because they were good human beings. And when I look at some of the images in Howard Zehr's book, Peachy, who did not get the benefit of the Supreme Court decision that released me, but she was a juvenile lifer.
Yes.
Someone that really stands out in the book was the late John Yount, who was pictured in the book holding a law library. John Yount killed himself at SCI Green in 2011. He had over 40 years in. And, John was someone that was one of my fiercest, I would say, in that friendly legal way, adversaries in the law library. John Yount was a stubborn old man that would battle you down. And I had some of my most strongest intellectual battles and dialogues with this man about law. And I think that, it's a shame that, he became so hopeless that he killed himself in 2011. I think of Aaron Fox, that's in that book. Kevin Saleem Mines in the book. I know these folks. When I was a kid walking the halls of Graterford, I remember those faces when they were younger, and then I remembered those faces as they got older. And that's, to me, more than anything, is the travesty here. That, again, and I just have to return to this, they could have been released back then, and they would be home contributing. Irving as well, contributing to society these past 20 years. But many of them, the majority of them, are still in prison, locked away 25, 30 years after that book came out. So I'm, have no problem saying that for those of us that have turned our life around on the inside, we've done this in spite of what the Department of Corrections has done. Not because of anything the Department of Corrections have done. We've done this because we were surrounded by prisoners that mentored us, encouraged us to take advantage of programs that pretty much were scarce, but also from a point of self-reliance and self-determination, better ourselves. And I think that is the most powerful example these men have had and women have had. Because Marie Scott, I can't forget Marie Scott. Marie Scott is one of our clients, to show you how full circle it goes. I remember reading Howard's book at SDI Huntington and seeing Marie and all of them 20 years ago, and here today, she is the lead plaintiff in a lawsuit that we are filing against the state to abolish second-degree murder in Pennsylvania. So they are all inspirations, and there is no justification. There's just no reason they should still be in prison, regardless if you believe in retribution, incapacitation, or rehabilitation. Those are the three prongs of mass incarceration in this country. They have filled all three of those.
Yes.
So, I believe that they should be home. They should have been home 20 years ago, and it's just a travesty of injustice that they are still in prison. And many others, not just them. There are many other untold portraits that Howard could go in and capture of lifers in Pennsylvania who should have been home, in some cases, many cases, decades ago.
And those who don't really know, I mean, in Pennsylvania, we have 5,447 people serving life without parole. That's 10% of the life without parole population in the country. There's only one state, Florida, that has more people serving life without parole than we do, and they have 13,000 people. And they have a larger prison population. And if you're charged with first or second degree murder in Pennsylvania, it's a mandatory minimum sentence. You're getting life without parole. No questions, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's life without parole. And so, I mean, that one of the things we're doing at Straight Ahead is working to create parole eligibility for lifers and a geriatric medical parole. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of this panel. So we got a question in from Dr. Timothy Holler. He's a criminal justice professor at Pitt Greensburg. And he just wanted to know, Howard, how does it feel to be on this same panel with Irvin Moore, not knowing that he would ever be released?
It's just absolutely astonishing. I keep thinking of meeting Irvin there, and I ran Irvin after the book. I ran into you a few times, but then I didn't see you after that. Some of the guys and some of the women I've been in contact, but I didn't see you for such a long time. But I heard about you from some of the other guys. So it is just such an honor and it's just such a treat to see you. And you look like you're doing so well. And I'm just thinking of the themes you're talking about. You had talked in that original interview about the importance of education and the old heads. You had a metaphor, if I remember correctly, of an insect caught in amber, didn't you? Well,
I did.
You're out of the amber now.
I am out of the amber.
You're out of the amber.
I don't know if people can recognize the analogy, but the environment of prison is unlike anything that you can imagine. And you asked me what it was like, and to a degree, I said it's like an insect that's finds himself stuck in amber, when amber is still a viscous, somewhat fluid kind of material. And slowly it begins to harden, and the movements of the insect start to slow down until he becomes encased in amber. It's hardened now. And I mean, that's where he's at. And that's what prison, to a degree, was like, being encased in amber. And I said, what I had been attempting to do by the grace of God was to move mentally and physically enough so that the liquid around me did not harden completely and I was not stuck there. And piggybacking on something that Saleem said about the old heads, everyone that he mentioned, I know them intimately. The majority of them, I saw them when they got there. And I did 52 years. I was in prison for 52 years. And I'm home now. I'm home. And people, when they talk to me, they say, well, Irvin, you're home for two reasons. One is because of the grace of God, which I believe wholeheartedly is true. Second of all, they said, you're home because you are such an exceptional individual. That's when I have to stop them. I mean, I'm flattered. I appreciate the compliment, but I tell them that they're wrong. They're wrong. I am not exceptional because there are so many men, women, and children exactly like me, still stuck behind bars, still stuck behind those walls or in those holes, who need to be home, who need to be doing the same things that Saleem is doing, who needs to be impacting their communities, their families, their neighborhoods, who needs to be impacting society in such a way that it could only be beneficial. And they're still there. And we need to do something about that. We have to do something about that.
Yeah, and that's why we're having this panel, where we can do something about it, where we can have that conversation, and it's all something Brian Stevenson always talks about, is changing the narrative. And that's what these conversations do. When people see you, when people see Saleem, they don't see a number. They don't see a person serving life without parole. They see somebody who is out in society, who is thriving, who is being an impact, and who is changing lives, and we're so thankful for that. And so this next question is for Howard and Barb. Gary Martell wanted to know about the faith of these individuals that you interviewed, either in the first book or the second book. Can you talk some about how their faith was getting them through these years and decades that they've spent in prison?
Barb, you want to take that?
Sure. Many of them talk about faith in a higher power or God, whoever fits with their understanding of faith. but finding lots of hope and strength through that relationship with the higher power, definitely part of that experience.
Okay, thank you. I mean, yeah, it's definitely something that you always have to grab onto. That faith gives you that hope to just persevere and to press on. Howard, with doing the first book and then doing the second book, what was it like to just think about the people that you interviewed in the first book and the individuals that had passed, that had died? How was that? I mean, how did it hit you?
Well, that was hard. That was hard. It was also hard in that one of the people in the book was due to get out. He had passed he had gotten the unanimous vote of the board of pardon. His papers were on the governor's desk, and he died of cold before he could get out.
Bruce.
That's hard. Yeah, Bruce. That's hard. But yeah, and then those who took their own lives, there were a number of them who took their own lives during those years. John Yount being one of them, but not the only one.
Well, thank you. Barb, can you talk about just when you were putting together all these stories, what impact were these men and women having on the prison itself? I mean, I know we've had Saleem and Irvin talk a little bit about what the old heads meant to them. Now I'd like for you to share a little bit about you reading their stories and the impact that they were having.
Yeah, what Irvin and Saleem already talked about was just a theme throughout the whole book of people speaking to the old heads that had inspired and supported them and walked with them, and how they were now becoming the old heads and the ones who were mentoring the young people coming in, and they, being the educators and the teachers in the prison, being the ones who are leading the organizations where others, the prisoner organizations that are there, that are developed and run by the men and women who are incarcerated, and the dog programs that they're taking leadership in, and really trying to create the community that they want to have within the prison community itself, and working really hard at that. And, I even think about my time at the Pennsylvania Prison Society when I was doing restorative justice work in prisons, and when I was starting to do that work and, wanting to make connections in the institutions, because when I started in 2000 at the Prison Society, I didn't know anybody in the prison, and I was already very familiar with doing life. And so I connected with the lifers at the institutions in order to start making some connections with restorative justice. And so they were the ones that were really, spearheading the efforts about how do we think about responsibility? How do we think about accountability? How do we think about the people that we've hurt in the context of committing violence? And that's still the case today. And definitely some of the people in Still Doing Life were involved and are still involved in doing some kind of restorative justice work within the institutions. So, I mean, Saleem and Irvin spoke so eloquently to it, and it's there. They are the mentors, they are the leaders, they are the educators, and the ones that are watching out for the younger folk. And, what I was just kind of also thinking, taking a little bunny trail off of that question is, one other thing. The old heads, one of you two, Saleem or Irvin, talked about the old heads doing these things and being involved in service and mentoring, not because they're getting anything out of the DOC. They're not getting any benefits from it. They do it because of who they are. And that was also a really strong theme in the Still Doing Life interviews. People speaking about, I do this because that's who I am and who I've always been. I'm always someone to give back. I'm always someone to be in service for other people. But I was also thinking about, the inspiration and the impact that they have on people in the community. And so their impact is not confined to just that prison environment. And I know that in my years of going in and out of, Graterford and Muncie and all those, I mean, I was deeply impacted by the work and am deeply inspired for the leadership skills. I was working with men and women who are developing their own programs, and they know how to do it. They got that stuff done. And they're like a great unifier for those of us out in the community as well. We know similar people in common in the community and have all this great respect that transcends the prison walls. And so, this idea of bringing them home, they're already making this impact in the community, and it's just think about how much more impact they would have if they would come home. And I imagine Irvin and Saleem, the ways that you're really impacting people. And, Irvin, I'm thinking of those college students who you're encountering and just how amazing that relationship must be for them.
So the next question is for you, Saleem and Irvin, and you guys hit it a little bit in some of your answers. When did you guys start impacting other people? Because I know, Saleem, you said that you had a hard head for quite a bit of time, So how far into your sentence do you think it was before you had that like aha moment, like, okay, I need to change? And then in that changing, it was helping other people change.
Since I am older than Saleem, I'll speak first.
just a little bit.
It took me about 5 years to settle down.
That's what I figured.
I was young, running around, strange environment, difficult environment, but I still had fire and passion and curiosity, and I wanted to know and I wanted to do. And we were just getting out of the 60s, so it was, again, a time of change, tremendous change. And when the old heads grabbed me one day, I tell this story a lot. I used to love to stand around the periphery of their circle while they're talking, while they're sharing knowledge amongst themselves. And that they would cast their eyes on me, and I'd keep my distance, but I'd listen. One day, one of the old heads called me and says, look, you want to stay around this circle, you have to have something on your mind, on your brain. Do you read? I said, of course I can read. Yeah, I can read. He said, well, here, take this book up to your cell, read it. And when you finish reading, come back and we'll talk about it. You can get in the circle and talk. I said, all right, okay. I grabbed the book, ran upstairs, threw it in the corner, and went and hung out with my young bucks. When I brought the book back down the next day with my head up high and said, oh, he said, well, what do you think about it? I said, it was a good book. Nice. He said, well, okay, what do you think about the central character, protagonist? What was the theme? And I didn't have the slightest idea what he was talking about. Now, one thing I would say about our old heads, and Saleem would back me up on this, they could all fight, especially coming from Philadelphia, coming from that region, coming from that era, because Philadelphia was a boxing town. Pennsylvania was a boxing state, and all our old heads knew how to prize fight. And I thought I was rough, but I had nothing for the old heads at all. And I saw that look in their eye, and it says, look, you didn't read that. Now, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you this book. You go upstairs, read it, then you bring it back and you tell us what it's about. And if you don't do that, you're going to get something. I took the book upstairs. I said, oh, man, come on, what it is? And I walked in my cell, sat down on the bed, opened it up. I said, and I started to read. This was about maybe 3 p.m. In those days, they turned the lights out. Lights out was at 12 midnight. So they called lights out, and they turned all the lights out in the cells, all the cells in those days. And I found myself in the doorway where a sliver of light was coming through a crack in the door. I was finishing final pages. I was entranced. I was enthralled. I was saying, how is this possible that something like this can be in a book? Now, I took the book back down the next day, and look, I couldn't wait to get to the circle. Chest out, head up. And they said, did you read the book? I said, I did. He says, okay, tell us a little bit about it. And of course, I could in no way describe exactly what was being said. But when I told them what I read and what I thought about it, they said, come on, get in here, get in this circle. And the name of the book was Man's Search for Meaning.
That's what I thought.
It was by an author named Viktor Frankl.
Yeah.
It wasn't about anything that I had ever known, but it was about my life. It was about my experience. It was about exactly what was happening to me and so many other people that I knew. Because it's about a concentration camp and life in a concentration camp. And the power, Viktor Frankl was a logotherapist, so he believed in the power of the word to make change, to move lives. And the word of God, the word of man, knowledge. And I couldn't help but talk to some of the young bucks that were my friends about what I had learned. So when I began, I think, to impact lives was at that point in my life, because I knew I had to. I knew it was necessary. I knew what it meant to me and what it could mean to other people in the prison who were like myself.
That was powerful. I think for me, it probably took me like 10 years to settle down. And when exactly I realized that my behavior was contributing to other people changing, I knew early on that a lot of my behavior was contributing people change to the worse, right? I knew that, right? Even younger, I knew that because, just the crowds that I ran with, the behaviors that I adopted. I don't really know the particular point that I realized that what was imparted to me was influencing younger prisoners coming through. I think a lot of it was people were looking to me for advice. People were looking for me to how to behave, to how to respond to guards. So I do think that I was aware of that. Some other things that I was really aware about was, I think the difference between me and Irvin's era is that I became an old head at 26, 27, 28 because the influx of younger prisoners in the 90s had it so that at 27, 28, the prison, like when I came through in 90, 91, there was not a lot of younger prisoners. But by 95, the influx of mass incarceration and the slew of laws, the 1990 crime bill, by the time I was 28, 29, these guys, the prisons were flipped over. The predominant age was 26 and over. The population was mainly 18 to 26, right? So I was like in this position where guys were calling me like old head, and I was like, what you talking about old head? Like, like, man, I ain't 30, I ain't old, So I recognized that like in the late 90s that actually not the late 90s, like the early 2000s, late 90s, that I was being looked upon now as someone who was a mentor. And it just shows you just how mass incarceration played such a part of that, because I just don't know how I would have looked at myself as being an old head or someone that's mentoring people had it not been that influx of so many prisoners. Because before that, us younger guys kind of stuck together as tribes because, you know, we had to inside of those camps. Whereas though it became by the time I left, like, God damn, there ain't no old heads in these joints. It's just so many young kids. And, you know, it became a situation where like even the DOC was overwhelmed by it, and they're not equipped to deal with not just children, but adolescents. You know, it's about warehouse people. So, you know, for me, I really don't know the exact point. I do know that throughout my incarceration, I definitely was looked at for like advice, how to carry yourself, how to conduct yourself. Because one thing I realized is that young prisoners coming through don't really have much to say, but they observe everything, how you act, how you carry yourself. More importantly, not just what you say, but how you act. Do you back up what you say, right? Because, you know, it's a suspicious environment and you have to be so hyper aware. And I was always aware that for me to be authentic, for me to be real, that is the best way for me to show them how to act. Oftentimes it was just the way I carried myself, whether it was dealing with other prisoners or with guards, and I carried myself in a way that I respected everyone, but I also made sure that you were going to respect me. And I did it in a way I think that a lot of younger dudes, a lot of guys who are younger now, when I talk to them, one of the things I always hear them say is that they learned how to carry themselves with a respect and dignity without like wielding a broadsword and being disrespectful and even dealing with staff, because I've always had a position and I would always tell the younger dudes, I deal with staff not as guards, but as human beings, regardless if they got a uniform on and I got a brown uniform on. I'm going to deal with them as they're a human because that's what they are, right? And once I was able to make that connection, or I was able to make that I'm trying to figure out a word
distinction.
That really, not just a distinction, but it was almost like I remember someone told me that power is in the prestige of an object, and prison guards' prestige is their uniform and the state. And I had to wipe that away and essentially say, look, I'm a man, you're a man. You may have that uniform and the state behind you, but that's prestige. Right here on this tier, on this range, it's you and me. And that's how I interacted with staff, whether it was a prison guard or a warden. And I think a lot of younger prisoners seen that and realized that they didn't have to like yell at guards or act, you know, crazy to be respected. That they could carry themselves as a human being and get respect.
Sure.
So that I don't know. That's just part of observation.
That was legitimate. That was real. It was valid.
So one of the questions that we have from one of the people viewing, this could be for you, Howard, and you could also answer a little bit too, Barb. Can you speak about the differences when working with the men that you interviewed compared to the women?
Well, one thing about the situation of women is that they have fewer resources and fewer opportunities for a variety of things, including commutation. So they have their very strong feelings of, you'll hear women who are lifers of the discrimination in effect, that they don't get the same possibilities, partly because they don't have the resources. It's also usually a more paternalistic or maternalistic environment. So the dynamics are quite different, but you hear the same themes about, they don't call them old heads, but the importance of older lifers who are mentors. You hear the same themes about trying to do good, make meaning of their lives, work with the younger people that are coming in. So many of the women that in the book were certified peer specialists working with young women coming in, facing a lot of the same dynamics that Saleem talks about there. But they're really hungry for contact because those prisons are, unlike, say, Graterford, Phoenix, which is near Philadelphia. They're out in the boonies. They're not nearly as many programs or volunteers involved. Barb, what would you add to that?
You know, I was kind of thinking two things. One, just about some of the really women who are really impactful is Peachy, who was mentioned earlier, Sharon Wiggins, who has since died since she was in the first book, and so wasn't interviewed for the second book. And our book is dedicated to her. And, several of the women, mention her in their interviews about how important she was for them. I'm also thinking this quarter, I just happened to be teaching a class on women in the criminal justice system. And what shows up in some of the interviews are some of those unique pathways that women in particular have for finding themselves incarcerated. So, at the hands of abuse and how they've reacted to that and other traumatic experiences that certainly the men have as well. But it really comes through in some of the women's interviews.
Yeah, and that's something that we definitely need to have a shift in with our system, is that our system only wants to look at somebody as an offender. It doesn't want to look at them as a victim who commits an offense, And a lot of this story is about the women. They experience sexual abuse, they experience domestic violence and situations like that, So it's definitely some place where we have to get to. And that's another one of those conversations changers that we have to have, and have lawmakers really look at it and have stories be told, and not just look at individual as a murderer, but somebody who experienced some adverse childhood experiences and other issues before they commit an offense. So Howard and Barb, can you talk some about your concerns and your perspective about life without parole?
Well, I'll go first here. I have real concerns about life without parole, but my goal on this project, our goal, is to be a catalyst for conversation. So rather, we say that in the book that we have a position on it, but our goal here is to humanize people, to let people speak for themselves, so that we can have, most of the conversations around crime and justice are done with stereotypes and generalizations. So my goal in this first book was to move that, to get us aware of that. So you'll notice the people in the books are shown without the prison walls, without the bars. They're shown with a background like a studio background, the way I'd want to be photographed. Incidentally, this is one of a number of books. There's a second book I did called Transcending Victims of Crime, Victims of Severe Crime, which is similar format, the same goal, to present people, let them speak without the generalizations and stereotypes. There's a third one, What Will Happen to Me, Children Whose Parents Are in Prison, similar kind of thing. So our goal here is to create opportunities for this kind of conversation. And so I would rather talk about that in this context than my own position on it. And Barb, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so definitely have concerns and definitely have my own perspectives. But what I'm thinking about, to add on to what Howard said, is that a theme among many of the people in Still Doing Life is, reflecting on the victims and the surviving family members of the people that they've harmed, and, wishing they could talk with them, or recognizing what they took away from the family. Or one gentleman, Craig Datesman, actually met with surviving family members of the person that he murdered and had a conversation and that sort of thing. And I think what becomes interesting when we think about them thinking about that and talking about that is it starts really raising questions about whether life without the possibility of parole, if not even long prison sentences or prison sentences generally, are actually doing accountability. Is it actually setting people up to face harms that they've caused and find meaningful ways to actually do that? And, attending to survivor needs. What do they need for justice in order to feel like the harm that they've had is repaired, if that's possible? Obviously very difficult to think about when we're talking about homicide. But, that gets at one of the concerns with it, is it really doing justice in a way that's helpful for everybody involved?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that everybody has to think about, is causing somebody to spend their entire life in prison, does that actually bring justice to family members? Does that bring healing? Does that bring it can never bring the person back, you know? So what is a place where we could get at where the person pays for what they did, but that they're also given that second chance, you know, because that's what we all want for people in life. You know, that's what April is about. It's about second chances, you know, and right now, the people that are serving life without parole have a very slim chance to get that second chance. And so the next question I have is about that second chance that you got, Irvin. What was the commutation process like? Can you kind of walk us through kind of briefly so people can get a good understanding of what somebody does to receive a commutation?
Yes. You use the term for me to walk you through rather briefly. Are you implying that I'm long-winded? I've heard this before.
Yes, but I
yeah.
also know that walking somebody through a whole commutation process could be a lengthy process too.
It
You
can
know,
be.
so
It
it
can
was
be.
putting both of them together.
Understanding the nature and the history of commutation, it's convoluted, it's disjointed and distorted, and it's a mechanism that, even though it's moving now more than it's moved in the last 40 plus years, it's still moving abysmally slow. It is impacting too few people. And again, you heard me say this before. We need to do better. We need to make change. But commutation for me, this was my third time applying. The first time I was on the governor's desk, I was approved by the board, and I was denied by the governor because commutation had become more political than anything. Yeah. At one time, it's a right that has been handed down since time out of mind. The executive clemency, executive privilege of whoever is the head of that state or head of the country or the king. You have the right to pardon someone or to award clemency for whatever reason. But in this country, especially in this state, it had become a political football to the extent that the mechanism stopped somewhere in the long before Reginald McFadden. It stopped when we had a governor that was coming into office, and there was a philosophical shift of mindset moving away from rehabilitation and toward retribution, toward punishment, toward being tough on crime. And we saw the advent of the prison industrial complex. So for me, it was a waiting game, a long and abysmally stupid waiting game. I was blessed to have people in my corner continually making sure that I was doing the right kinds of things, that I kept hope. I have a strong, abiding belief and faith in God, and that helped me so much. But within the last 3 or 4 years, something has started to happen that we could see, and we have the Lieutenant Governor Fetterman and Governor Wolf to thank for that. They were looking, for whatever reason, the economics of it, I don't know. Compassion, justice, I don't know. I'm not even going to speak on that. But they were looking at the mechanism itself and saying, it's broken. Let's try to do something to fix this. And they started to do this. And by starting to do this, I mean, we've had more lifers commuted within the last 8 years than we've had in almost 40 years. It's under one governor. So it's something that can happen, that should be happening more. I tell people that when I first came into the system, and I'm going to keep this brief, under 2 governors, Shapp and Schaefer, we saw over 200 lifers commuted. Now think about that. Just under 2 governors. From that time till now, it hasn't been 200 lifers commuted. And that's in the last 50 years. So it's something that can be done. And legislatively, we need to do that. Remember, whoever is listening to my words, the legislators work for you. You don't work for them. They work for you. If you want the laws to be changed, tell them. Make them do it. And that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, and I mean, think about the time you were talking about from 1971 to 1978. There were 250 commutations, and they were using commutation as a parole by proxy,
Yes.
And a lot of things that we've heard is that the people who were getting life without parole sentences back then were told that they were going to serve anywhere from 18 to 22 years and then receive a commutation.
Yeah.
And now you have people like you who didn't receive a commutation for 52 years, and that's why we're doing this work, because we want to help see these men and women come home. So
Indeed.
The next question is for you, Saleem. When you started hearing about the Supreme Court cases that Bryan Stevenson had won, Miller versus Alabama, Montgomery versus Louisiana, and Graham versus Florida, how did that make you feel? Did that thought process of potentially getting a chance to get out start resonating, and then did it continue to build up until the day that you had that resentencing?
I mean, those, the whole, well, let me just back up, walk back. So for me, and even though I was sentenced to spend the rest of my life in prison, I never accepted that. Even though I knew the odds were against me, even though I saw people around me who were in similar situations like myself, who have been in prison for 50 or 60 years, I never accepted that my fate would be to die in prison, at least die in prison passively,
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think some things, and my behavior contributed to that, and a lot of the trouble I got into and a lot of the prisons that I was housed in for years reflected that. I was in maximum security prisons where my movement was controlled. I wasn't I'm not going to say I was incorrigible, but I never, even to the day I walked out of prison, I never adjusted to prison. Every day was as miserable as the previous day. Now, what I will say is this, that Roper versus Simmons changed a lot. Roper versus Simmons, in that case, when sentencing children to the death sentence was found to be unconstitutional, there was a little line in that sentence where Justice Scalia and Thomas said that by us doing this, we now open the floodgates for offenders who were sentenced to life without parole as children to be sent to challenge their sentences. I forget the exact words, but he said, because in the very international law that this court has adopted that prohibits children from being, that this court has referenced, let me rephrase that, has referenced, because they didn't adopt it, it has referenced that it is, you cannot sentence child offenders to death, but it also said, nor shall they be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of release. That dissent by Scalia and Thomas sparked an entire movement who latched onto that and said, hey, can't send, if you're referencing international law, then don't stop at the death sentence. You now have to include the other death sentence that the United Nations adopted that said, nor shall they be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of release. And I was a part of that. My sister was the state coordinator for the national campaign for the fair sentencing of youth. I was involved in organizing other juvenile lifers inside of the prisons to get our families together. So this was a movement. My sister went to Geneva to testify in front of the United Nations as a delegate for Fight for Lifers and Reconstruction, Inc., and the Human Rights Coalition here in Philadelphia. Other members of family went to DC to testify, Harrisburg. So for me, I'm a part of this movement, and I'm seeing that we're growing stronger, we're feeling empowered, and that we could win. So Graham comes, strikes down mandatory life without parole sentence for juveniles who had non-homicide offenses. And Miller comes up, and, even Miller, was really a very safe case for Bryan Stevenson to take, because if a lot of people recall, and this was a big heated argument and point of tension within our movement, Bryan Stevenson deliberately took cases that were 14 and younger to bring before the United States Supreme Court. And we were saying, whoa, you're going to create another carve out. This might carve us. But then through dialogue, it was like, look, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. We're going to start here, but we're going to stagger this, and we're going to work with it in incremental bites. And that was something that we were able to accept, because we were in the room talking in our families. We didn't feel left out. We knew that if this case was won, Bryan Stevenson wasn't going to pack up and say, okay, I abolished life without parole for children 14 and under. I'm done. My day is done. I'm going to retire. We knew that we were coming back. The United States Supreme Court, I think, also knew, like, let's just nip this in the bud right now. And we're fortunate that they did that, because as we've seen, the court changed, right?
Yeah.
We didn't have a couple years, Had Miller not been decided in 2012, very easily, I could not be home. I would not be home, right? Because this new court rolled Miller back already in Jones versus Alabama, right? So for me, I was preparing myself to come home. I think once Montgomery came out, I knew I was walking out of prison. I remember walking back from the law library, and I was back at SCI Green, Supermax prison. I was pissed because I was sent back to that prison from SCI Cole for organizing a food protest back there. And I just remember walking back from the law library after that decision came down and saying, I'm going to walk out this prison, and I did 2 years later, So for me, that's just a lesson for people who have loved ones in prison. Never give up hope, never give up the fight. My mother, who passed away in 2004, did not have the opportunity to see me come home, but her last words to me was, never give up. And I took those words, that was always in my spirit. And that's something that I just encourage family members and people in prison, never give up. When you give up, that's when it's over. That's one thing I've learned.
Thank you so much. And Irvin, Saleem, definitely so thankful that both of you had those doors open, that you're out here, that you're in this fight, because it's impactful to have your voice and your experience, and just being able to continue to humanize those men and women that are incarcerated. That's what's so powerful about these books that Barb and Howard have done, but also hearing from lifers that are coming home, and them being able to talk about and humanize those individuals that are still on the inside that we're fighting for. They're not just a number. They're not a dollar sign, So Barb and Howard, when we think about restorative justice, how can we go to a system that's focusing more on restorative justice? And how does restorative justice look towards a violent offense or a homicide conviction? Now it's into the tough questions.
Yeah, no kidding. So I'll let Barb go first. That gonna work?
Oh, you were serious.
I'm serious, but I
joking. Yeah, I think restorative justice is really something important to be considering. And for those who are listening who don't know what it is, it's an approach to justice where instead of just, finding the offender, blaming them and finding their guilt and then punishing them for what they did and hope things are going to change, we think differently and kind of think about, who's been hurt in this situation and how have they been hurt? And then how do we go about trying to repair that harm? And, with a very different value set than what we typically think about in our criminal legal system, where it's punishment, it's revenge, it's tit for tat, those kinds of values, that where restorative justice is really coming to this place of, respecting everybody, participation, where people actually are actively involved in naming needs, naming obligations, and, really understanding what happened in the course of some kind of harm doing. And that includes fatal harm doing. People are profoundly hurt. And how do we go about, addressing that and being part of their transformation and journey forward? How do we find meaningful ways for people to, deeply understand the harm that's been caused, and finding ways for them to meaningfully address that, recognizing you can't bring someone back. But are there, other systems that can be involved in this? And I think some of the exciting things that are happening with restorative justice is the more conversation and clear conversation about causes of crime that go beyond just the supposed pathology of an individual, but really looking at structural issues that are coming into play that lead to harm doing, whether we have communities that are set up where people are in relationship to minimize harm doing, or to even just show care and support for one another. So I think there are a lot of things that we can be doing to move towards a restorative justice system. One of the most common forms of restorative justice is victim offender dialogue. And some of the most powerful dialogues that are happening are in crimes of violence, where people have been murdered or attempted murder, rape, and sexual assault, because the harm is so deep that it creates quite an amazing space in which to safely speak to that profound harm that's been caused. Recognizing the safe doesn't mean you're comfortable, but you're brave and able to kind of put it out there. The question is, how do we move in that direction? I like that idea of how you would eat an elephant, just one bite at a time. And I think there are already some of those first steps being taken with, countless numbers of victim offender dialogue programs right now that are in the working with youth who have caused harm, and the people who've experienced it, but also in the case of violence and fatal harm doing. And some amazing organizations out there that are simultaneously working with survivors and harm doers around causes, and doing circle and healing work with both groups separately and individually. So I think there's some real promise. I think we have to find some political will. We have to work at the community level to actually have people really think about the role of punishment in their lives and how they understand harm doing, and really build some strong communities. But again, one bite at a time. Howard, I'm really curious now how you would follow up.
Well, I would add that I believe that if we included those who have been harmed in this from the beginning, we would not. You would be surprised how progressive it could be. I've had the opportunity and the privilege of working with victims of crime for many years, and there's a whole when you're harmed by crime or other things, there's a whole series of needs that you have. And some of those needs, you have to go to your therapist and your family and so forth. But there's a group of what I call justice needs. There's 4 or 5 things that people who've been harmed need from a justice process, and they do not get it from the court system. And part of the reason we often think of victims being retributive, they're not as retributive as we think they are. When you do surveys, actually, it's a miss. The press and the politicians act like they are, but they're not. That's not where they're really at. But if we would if a process meets those needs, I find that people can move on their journeys, much more easily, much better, and that they're less concerned about long-term prisons and so forth. So I really believe if we would incorporate the needs of victims, restorative justice is really victim-centered. It's not victim-controlled, but it's victim-centered. When a harm happens, the first thing we ought to be able to do is figuring out who's been harmed and what are their needs. And then we move to how do we meet those needs, whose obligation is it to move those needs. I was on the victim advisory group of the U.S. Sentencing Commission for a few years. That's the Sentencing Commission sets the guidelines for federal judges. And I was dismayed at how few of those justice needs of victims were in those guidelines. And I got discouraged at the possibility of increasing that, and I left after my term was up. But I really think if we incorporated those needs into our justice process, we would end up with something that looked like restorative justice.
Can we make you a Supreme Court judge tomorrow? You know, I mean, thank you, Barb and Howard, for just giving us those definitions and how we can actually apply that more, you know, because that's really where we need to get to, that transformative and restorative justice place where everybody's being healed, you know, because that doesn't happen in our system right now.
Yeah.
So, Irvin, not only I wanted to know this question, but Elaine wanted to know, or there was a question as far as like, how are you doing and how was it to be commuted with Fred? I mean, both of you received a commutation and released the same day. How was that?
Well, like Saleem said, I always knew I was going to come home. And I never thought it was a pipe dream. I didn't think it would take this long, but I'm home. It felt like something I had always thought it would feel like, a rebirth for me. I have done, since I've been home, things that I've only dreamed of. But these things that I've done are things that are normal in the normal life of any citizen, of any human being. The things that I have done are just normal things. But I am living. Fred is here. For those of you who have not seen Fred, I hope you can see him right now. Hey, boy. But that's Fred. It's my baby, 170 pounds, Saint Bernard, and we're both here. Fred came to me in Rockview Prison, was with me 2 or 3 years in there, and when I was released, the first thought that I felt was that I'm going to have to leave Fred, and oh, my heart hurt. My heart hurt. The warden was there. It was 4:30 in the afternoon. The warden, the deputy warden, two wardens, in fact, one was retiring, and they came over and they brought me the commutation papers. When the warden saw the look in my eyes when I just said, "Oh, Fred," she felt sorry for me and reached behind her back. She stopped playing games and pulled another piece of paper out that had Fred's name on it. They gave him my last name. Said Fred Moore, the dog, is going home with you, and they told me we're leaving tomorrow. And we left Rockview and went to Johnstown Halfway House, March 26th. I was there 2 months. I was supposed to be there a year. But again, God stepped in and good supporters who have been, you know, reentry. Reentry is becoming such a huge thing because it's necessary. Reentry because people are coming home. We want more people to come home, but we don't want them or need them to come home to nothing. We don't need them to come home to no jobs, no houses, no wherewithal, no support. And I have been blessed to have that. I've been blessed to have that. People in my life who have taken care of my family, my friends, my loved one, the community here. And we need, again, to set up systems that will take care of people coming out, not to support them solely, but to give them what they need so that they can fend for themselves. We need training and jobs and houses before they even get out of prison. They need to be coming home to those kinds of things. Now, these are all things that we can contribute to and help set up now. And we need to be doing those kinds of things. But in answer to your question, I am blessed. And everyone that I talk to, I let them know that I am blessed and so are they.
Well, I wish we had another 2 or 3 hours to just keep going and just talking, because this has just been just so amazing, and your experiences, the work that you, Barb, and Howard have done around restorative justice around these 2 books is amazing. Definitely, if you don't have Doing Life or Still Doing Life, go out, get it. You will not. It's a book that you need to read. It's
Indeed.
so powerful. It's gonna tug on your heartstrings, and it's gonna give you a different view and look at people who have committed murder. And that's what we're trying to do at Straight Ahead. We are fighting for lifers. We're working on SB 135, which is a parole lifer bill. We're working on SB 835, which is a geriatric medical parole. These are bills that we're working to get passed, because this population, no one else is fighting for them. So we're here, we're working on opening these doors for these individuals so they can come home and they can be beneficial and provide the same support, encouragement, and be the impact that they are in prison in their communities. So a little bit about that. May 3rd, we have a general power meeting. You can go to our website to look at that. And May 25th, we're going to Harrisburg. We're having a rally. We're partnering with CADB, the Coalition to Abolish Death by Incarceration, Human Rights Coalition, Abolitionist Law Center, and other organizations. Come out, help us support these bills. We're going to do some lobbying in the morning. We would love to have you out there. If you're family members, come tell your stories. Your stories are what makes things happen. I always tell people, data makes you think, stories make you feel, and both of those together make you want to act. So I want to thank you, Howard. I want to thank you, Barb. I want to thank you, Irvin. I want to thank you, Saleem, for all being here, sharing, being so open and transparent with everybody here. Thank you for all of those people that were on the panel tonight. We've recorded this, so I'll send a copy to all of you so you can share it. And we're going to be putting it out on social media so people who weren't able to make it tonight are able to look at this and to hear this amazing conversation. So again, thank you so much. And you can definitely reach out, follow Howard, Zehr, and Barb, and the amazing work that they're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be on the panel with you all. Have a good night, everybody.
Indeed.
Thank you.